In the marble palaces of ancient Rome, emperors ruled with gold, blood, and desire. Among them, Nero, the tyrant whose madness burned Rome, found his obsession not in a queen or noblewoman, but in a slave girl. She was called Claudia Acte, a courtesan who rose from chains to the emperor's bed, only to discover that in Rome's palace of power, being desired was more dangerous than being forgotten. This is her untold story. Claudia Acte's life began not in splendor, but in bondage. Born in the Greek provinces under Roman rule, she entered the world as property. Her childhood was marked not by family warmth, but by the harsh discipline of masters and the looming fear of sale. For girls like her, there was no inheritance, no home, only the certainty that one day she would be led to the market, her fate determined by another's purse. When she was still young, she was brought to Rome. The capital of the empire was a place of magnificence, but for the enslaved, it was a city of cages. The streets thundered with triumphal parades, senators carried themselves like gods, and emperors sat upon thrones of gold. Yet beneath this spectacle lay a hidden economy of flesh, the endless buying and selling of human lives. Among the most prized were the beautiful girls destined not for labor, but for pleasure. Acte was one of them. From the moment she was paraded in Rome's slave markets, her value was in her youth, her beauty, and her obedience. Traders examined her body as if she were livestock, commenting on her form, her posture, her potential. To the wealthy, she was not a child but an investment, a living ornament meant to entertain, to serve, and to obey without question. Acte was purchased into the household of the imperial court itself, a world more perilous than any brothel or tavern. Here, girls were trained not merely as servants, but as performers, singers, dancers, and courtesans meant to delight Rome's highest men. To survive, Acte had to learn quickly the art of silence, the grace of movement, the delicate balance of submission and allure. Every mistake brought punishment. Every success brought another test. The palace itself dazzled her eyes, marble columns gleaming under torchlight, walls painted with the gods of Olympus, halls echoing with music and laughter. But to Acte, those walls soon felt like chains. For slaves, beauty was a curse. It drew the eye of masters, binding them to desires they could never refuse. In whispered corners, she learned the fate of others like her. Some courtesans rose to favor, showered in jewels, only to be discarded when age or boredom claimed them. Others disappeared, their names never spoken again. Survival was never certain. Yet in this dangerous world, Acte's path was leading her toward the gaze of the most powerful and unpredictable man in Rome, Emperor Nero. At this time, Nero was still young, barely beginning the reign that history would come to remember for madness and cruelty. But already, whispers of his excesses rippled through the palace. He loved music, theater, and women, especially those who defied the noble expectations of the Senate. It was this taste for scandal that would bring Acte into his life. For now, she remained a shadow, one among many palace slaves. But her beauty and quiet strength made her stand out. She did not yet know that her chains, once forged in a Greek marketplace, were about to bind her to an emperor. Her story was no longer just about survival. It was about becoming Rome's most desired courtesan and paying the terrible price of that desire. Rome was the beating heart of the world, and in its veins flowed not only gold and power, but human misery. At the center of this misery stood the slave markets, vast, open-air theaters of humiliation where men, women, and children were displayed like cattle. It was here that Claudia Acte, like so many others, was brought under the burning Mediterranean sun, her body stripped of dignity, her future reduced to a price. The slave markets were held in public squares, often near temples or major crossroads. Wooden platforms were built to elevate the captive so potential buyers could examine every angle. Around them, banners fluttered to mark their origin: Greek, Gaul, Egyptian. For Romans, Such words carried meaning. Greeks were valued for their education, Gauls for their strength, Egyptians for their exotic allure. Acte, as a Greek girl, was considered desirable not only for her beauty, but for the refinement associated with her people. The ritual of sale was calculated cruelty. Captives were forced to stand in silence as buyers prodded them like livestock. Teeth were inspected, skin was pinched, bodies were turned and judged. Traitors shouted out their supposed virtues: youthful, fertile, skilled in song, obedient. Every word stripped away humanity, turning the girl into a commodity. For Acte, the ordeal was not just physical, but psychological. Each leering gaze reminded her that she had no claim to herself, no right to refuse. She belonged to whichever man could pay the highest price. For many girls, this was the most terrifying moment of their lives, knowing that beyond the platform, the path forked into nightmares. The mines, the fields, the brothels, or for the rare few, the palaces. On the day she was sold, the bidding was swift. A member of the imperial household saw her not merely as another servant, but as potential ornamentation for Rome's highest stage, the court of Emperor Nero. She was purchased, marked, and transported under guard, leaving behind the marketplace that had swallowed countless nameless souls. But even within Rome's hierarchy of suffering, there was irony. To be bought for the palace was at once salvation and damnation. It spared Acte from the crushing labor of the fields or the degradation of the lowest brothels. Yet it also condemned her to a life where survival meant pleasing the whims of the most dangerous man alive. The palace system relied on slaves like Acte, noble women, bound by rigid expectations of modesty, could not satisfy every appetite of Rome's rulers. Instead, emperors filled their halls with courtesans, musicians, and dancers, slaves who could be possessed without scandal, discarded without consequence. To the Senate, these women were an embarrassment, a corruption of Roman dignity. To the emperor, they were indispensable. Acte entered this world carrying scars no one could see, the shame of public exposure, the trauma of being auctioned like an object. Yet in the palace she would need to mask that pain. Here, the cost of weakness was humiliation. Here, beauty was both armor and chain. As Acte crossed the marble thresholds of Nero's household, she stepped into a realm where power was absolute and cruelty was spectacle. She was no longer merely a slave. She was a piece in the emperor's private theater. The girl once sold on a platform would soon find herself standing before the emperor himself. And with that, her fate as Rome's most desired courtesan began to take shape. The palace was not merely a residence, it was an institution, a machine designed to transform slaves into instruments of pleasure, entertainment, and obedience. For Claudia Acte, entering its inner chambers was the beginning of a brutal education. The girl who had once been auctioned under the sun now stood in the shadow of Rome's marble halls, where every breath, every gesture, every glance would be molded for one purpose: to please. In Rome, the courtesan was not a mistress by choice, but a product of deliberate training. Acte was placed under the supervision of older women and eunuchs who specialized in turning slaves into ornaments of the court. These were not tutors in kindness. They were disciplinarians, charged with erasing whatever fragments of self a girl carried and replacing them with the polish of performance. Her first lessons were in silence. A courtesan's voice was never her own. She was taught when to speak and when to remain quiet, how to shape her words like honey, and how to conceal her thoughts behind a mask of submission. A misplaced word, an accidental display of will, could invite punishment, sometimes lashes, sometimes worse. Obedience was survival. Next came the arts of allure. Acte was trained to walk with grace, her steps measured as if the floor itself were watching. She learned how to move her hands while pouring wine, how to lower her gaze without seeming weak, how to look into the eyes of powerful men without appearing insolent. Every motion was rehearsed, every mistake corrected with ruthless precision. Music and dance followed. Acte's voice, once trembling, was drilled into a soft instrument of song. She was forced to memorize melodies that entertained emperors at their feasts, verses that glorified Rome, and even the bawdy lyrics that made men laugh in drunken revelry. Her body, too, became an instrument, swaying in dances drawn from Greece, Egypt, and the East, choreographed not for art but for seduction. Punishment accompanied every lesson. If her voice cracked, she was slapped. If her steps faltered, she was beaten with rods. If she dared show defiance, she was isolated without food. In these chambers, pain was a teacher and fear was the curriculum. Day by day, Acte's identity dissolved until the girl was hidden behind the courtesan mask Rome demanded. The humiliation was deliberate. Courtesans were dressed in finery, paraded at banquets, and made to shine like jewels, yet beneath the silks they remained slaves. Acte came to understand this contradiction. She was admired but not respected, desired but not free. Her beauty was celebrated only because it belonged to someone else. What set Acte apart, however, was her endurance. While other girls broke under the weight of humiliation, she learned to use it. She became adept at masking her pain, at offering what was demanded without surrendering the last fragments of herself. Within her silence, she stored the memories of her past, her Greek blood, her stolen childhood, her unspoken rage. These inner reserves gave her a strength the trainers could not destroy. In time, her transformation was complete. Acte emerged from training not as a mere servant, but as a polished courtesan, fit for the gaze of Rome's highest men. She was placed among the select group of women reserved for the emperor's private entertainments, a world of feasts, music, and whispered indulgence. Yet even then, Acte knew what this meant. To be chosen by Nero was not a blessing. It was to step into the fire of his desires, into a world where power was a weapon and cruelty was a game. As she waited in jeweled garments for the emperor's gaze, she felt the weight of her new role. She was no longer simply a slave. She was about to become the obsession of a man whose name history would remember for madness. And for Acte, the price of becoming Rome's most desired courtesan was only beginning to unfold. The corridors of the imperial palace were filled with whispers. Among the countless faces of slaves, musicians, and courtesans, one name began to circulate in hushed tones: Acte. Her beauty was not loud or flamboyant. It carried a quiet dignity that made her stand apart. It was this subtle grace, combined with her carefully honed training, that first caught the attention of the most dangerous man in Rome, Emperor Nero. Nero was still in the early years of his reign, yet already consumed by extravagance. Barely out of adolescence, he styled himself as an artist, a poet, a god of music. But beneath the veneer of performance lay a man with insatiable desires and a cruelty that knew no limits. While senators debated laws and Rome's people clamored for bread, Nero surrounded himself with entertainment, feasts that lasted days. Singers from Greece, dancers from the East, and among this endless spectacle, he noticed Acte. At first, it was only a glance. During a banquet, as slaves poured wine and musicians plucked their instruments, Nero's eyes lingered on her longer than custom allowed. Acte felt the weight of his gaze like a brand upon her skin. She lowered her eyes as trained, but inside fear surged. To be noticed by the emperor was not a triumph. It was a sentence. Soon she was summoned privately. Nero had her brought to his chamber, where he demanded not only her presence, but her voice. Unlike other courtesans who flattered him with rehearsed praise, Acte's quietness intrigued him. When she spoke, it was with the soft accent of her Greek origin, a reminder of the cultured world Rome admired but had conquered. Her very presence seemed exotic, different from the noble women bound by rigid Roman customs. For Nero, this difference became an obsession. He lavished her with gifts, silks, perfumes, and jewels, luxuries unimaginable for a slave. But these treasures were not tokens of love. They were chains of a new kind. Each gift bound her more tightly to him, reminding her that her body, her freedom, and her fate now belonged to the emperor. Acte became Nero's secret indulgence. He flaunted her at private banquets, seating her closer than was acceptable for a slave. Senators gritted their teeth in disgust, whispering that their emperor had disgraced Rome by elevating a mere courtesan to his side. But Nero thrived on such scandal. The more his court resisted, the more he clung to Acte. For Acte, every encounter was a performance of survival. She smiled when expected, endured his drunken ramblings, and listened as he fancied himself a great artist. Yet behind her calm mask lay terror. She had seen what happened to those who disappointed emperors. One careless word, one flicker of displeasure, and her life could be ended without question. Nero's obsession offered her protection from other men, but it also placed her under the unrelenting spotlight of imperial power. Whispers spread beyond the palace walls. The people of Rome heard rumors of a slave girl who had captured their emperor's heart. Some mocked Nero for humiliating the empire with such low-born company. Others envied Acte, imagining her life as one of luxury. But Acte herself knew the truth. She was both adored and imprisoned, elevated yet enslaved. The emperor's passion was not love. It was possession. As the months passed, Nero's obsession deepened. He paraded her in private circles, ignoring the growing fury of his wife, Empress Octavia. Acte, once a nameless girl sold at market, now stood at the center of Rome's most dangerous triangle, caught between an emperor's madness, a wife's silent rage, and a senate's disgust. Her survival would depend not on beauty alone, but on her ability to navigate the treacherous world of imperial desire. The girl who had been trained to please now had to learn how to endure the emperor's love, a love that could at any moment become her death. Once Claudia Acte captured Nero's fascination, her life changed irrevocably. She was no longer a shadow among slaves. She became a visible presence in the imperial palace. Marble halls that once intimidated her now echoed with her measured steps. Dressed in silks and adorned with jewels, she moved through the corridors as both ornament and observer, knowing every eye in the palace studied her, some with envy, some with lust, some with hatred. For Acte, the palace was both stage and cage. She dined alongside the emperor during private feasts, her place reserved at his side, yet she was never a true equal. While Nero lavished her with attention, her status remained that of a slave. The courtiers whispered behind closed doors, mocking the audacity of a girl born in chains who now shared a chamber with the emperor. Every gesture she made had to be careful. Every word calculated, for misstep meant humiliation or worse. The presence of Empress Octavia intensified the danger. Though her anger was restrained publicly, Octavia's silent fury was evident in the court. Noble women avoided Acte, their eyes cold with disdain. Servants whispered that the empress would have preferred the girl removed by any means necessary. Acte, trained in the arts of subtlety and survival, learned to walk a delicate line. She must remain captivating to Nero while invisible to the scrutiny of others. Despite these perils, Acte's rise within the palace was undeniable. Nero displayed her before his closest allies, reveling in their discomfort. At private banquets, she entertained senators with song and dance, her body moving with the elegance and precision honed during years of training. Each performance solidified her reputation. She was no longer a slave girl. She had become Rome's most desired courtesan, a figure of fascination and revulsion alike. But luxury brought its own torment. Acte's evenings were often spent at Nero's side, listening to his caprices and enduring his temper. Some nights he was tender, almost gentle. Other nights, his madness erupted in cruelty, turning the palace into a chamber of terror. Each act of desire carried a weight. One wrong glance, one hesitation, could undo all her careful navigation of palace life. The silks and jewels could not protect her from the emperor's wrath. Even within the emperor's affection, Acte remained a prisoner. She had been trained to obey, to entertain, to endure. Yet now the stakes were far higher. Every smile, every bow, every note of song was measured against the emperor's unpredictable mood. Senators and guards watched silently, ready to report disobedience, ensuring that the courtesan's compliance was never optional. In this gilded cage, Acte discovered another form of power. She began to observe, to learn the hidden politics of Nero's court. She memorized the rivalries among courtiers, the fears of guards, the secrets of senators. Knowledge, she realized, could grant her safety where beauty alone might fail. For a slave elevated to the emperor's bed, intellect became armor as much as obedience. Yet the palace also brought the sting of public contempt. Letters, rumors, and whispers spread beyond the walls, mocking her audacity, her lowly birth, and her proximity to imperial power. The city of Rome, with all its grandeur, became a court of judgment. Acte's name was known, her beauty admired, but her humanity questioned. She was a commodity elevated to obsession, desired by one, despised by many, and forever marked by her origin. Through it all, she endured. She remained captivating, intelligent, and ever observant. Each day inside Nero's palace was a lesson in survival: how to command attention without arrogance, how to offer charm without inciting hatred, and how to be the most desired woman in Rome while knowing that desire was as dangerous as any blade. In the marble halls where the emperor ruled, Claudia Acte had found her place. But even as she shone in the candlelight, she understood a terrible truth. In the world of imperial desire, one's rise could be as fleeting as it was spectacular. The next shift of Nero's favor could turn admiration into ruin. And she, the most desired courtesan in Rome, lived constantly on the edge of that peril. While Claudia Acte navigated the gilded halls of Nero's palace, the world outside whispered with scorn. Rome's elite looked upon her rise with disbelief and rage. To senators, magistrates, and noble matrons, a slave girl's proximity to the emperor was an affront to tradition and dignity. Acte's beauty, carefully honed by training, was no shield against their contempt. In the corridors of power, desire for her clashed violently with hatred of her origins. Letters and secret messages carried their disapproval. Senators decried Nero's indulgence, framing the courtesan as a symbol of corruption. In private homes, matrons whispered about her audacity, shaming the emperor for allowing a girl born in chains to dine and entertain among Rome's elite. Even palace attendants, who were accustomed to slavery, regarded her with unease. They feared her closeness to Nero and resented the luxury that came with it. The emperor, however, reveled in the scandal. The more the elite disapproved, the more he flaunted Acte. He paraded her during private feasts, made her perform songs and dances that drew attention from powerful men, and insisted on her presence during ceremonies of intimacy and entertainment. Nero's obsession with the courtesan became both her protection and her peril. She was shielded from other men's predatory attention, yet bound more tightly to the unpredictable whims of a capricious emperor. For Acte, the wrath of Rome's elite was a constant shadow. She understood the stakes. Admiration could turn to violence, curiosity to insult. Each performance demanded perfection, each gesture measured. In the palace, she learned to anticipate the envy and fury around her. Courtesans were instruments of display, and any misstep could invite punishment not only from the emperor, but also from those who resented her presence. Yet the scrutiny offered a dangerous form of clarity. Through whispers and letters, Acte discerned the political and social calculations behind the anger. Her low birth was a weapon used against her, a reminder of how precarious her position truly was. The elite's fury also revealed their fears. She, a slave, could wield influence merely by captivating the emperor. Desire had become power, and with it came a perilous visibility. At times, Acte was left isolated, enduring the tension of meals and ceremonies while the elite studied her. In those moments, she remembered the lessons of her training. Calmness, grace, and silence could be shields as effective as her beauty. Every smile, every note of song was an exercise in survival. She became adept at reading expressions, sensing when her presence excited anger or admiration. The emperor's indulgence protected her, yet it could not erase Rome's judgment. Outside the palace, letters circulated describing her as scandalous and immoral, a foreign girl who had dared to rise above her station. Even within the palace, servants and courtiers murmured with contempt. Acte understood that in this world, desire and hatred were inseparable. To be desired by one was to be condemned by many. Through it all, she endured. The wrath of Rome's elite reminded her of the fragile nature of power. Desire could elevate a slave to unimaginable heights, but it could vanish in a heartbeat. Acte had become Rome's most desired courtesan, yet she remained acutely aware that envy, fear, and hatred surrounded her constantly. In the halls of power, the finest silks could not protect against the sharp edge of elite wrath. Claudia Acte had learned the delicate balance of survival in Nero's palace, but each day brought new threats. Being the emperor's most desired courtesan was a dangerous position, a gilded existence in which admiration and peril were inseparable. Every glance from Nero was a blessing and a risk. Every whispered conversation a potential trap. One wrong word, one hesitated smile, and even the emperor's favor could turn to ruin. The palace was alive with intrigue. Courtiers, guards, and attendants observed Acte constantly, noting her gestures, her posture, her interactions with the emperor. They whispered behind closed doors, plotting subtle ways to undermine her or to curry favor with those who resented her presence. Envy was a powerful weapon in Rome, and Acte, elevated beyond her birth, had become its target. Nero's desire was unpredictable. Some mornings he admired her calm intelligence and delicate beauty, praising her in private gatherings. Other nights, intoxicated by his whims, he lashed out, scolding her for imagined slights or forcing humiliating displays of obedience. Acte learned to mask fear with composure, to anticipate the shifts in his temperament before they became dangerous. Her training as a courtesan was now survival at the highest level. Every movement, word, and expression had to navigate both pleasure and peril. The emperor's obsession also brought her close to perilous knowledge. Acte overheard conversations that revealed plots, rivalries, and the emperor's violent tendencies. She glimpsed the tension between Nero and his mother, Agrippina, and saw the growing resentment of the Senate. These revelations were as dangerous as any whip. A misplaced comment could brand her as a traitor. Yet knowledge also became a shield. By observing the patterns of power, Acte learned to move invisibly through a world of danger while remaining indispensable to Nero. Despite her elevated status, the palace walls reminded her daily that she was still a slave. Every gift of silk or jewel was a reminder that her body, her freedom, and her life belonged to another. Courtesans were prized, but only as long as they pleased the emperor. Once desire shifted, once favor waned, exile or humiliation could follow. Acte knew this, and it made every encounter with Nero a calculated risk. The tension extended beyond Nero's chambers. Empress Octavia's silent fury lingered like a shadow. Noblewomen plotted subtle retribution, refusing to acknowledge Acte's presence except to deliver veiled insults. Even the guards, who owed loyalty to the emperor, watched her with suspicion. To live in the palace was to exist in a constant state of alertness, balancing charm and fear, obedience and self-preservation. Yet, through it all, Acte endured. She had become a master of subtlety, reading moods, gauging danger, and tempering desire with caution. In a world where the emperor's whims could elevate or destroy, she learned to walk the knife's edge, surviving not through defiance but through understanding the volatile forces around her. In the marble corridors of Nero's palace, Claudia Acte had transformed from a sold slave to Rome's most desired courtesan. But with every moment of favor came the looming shadow of danger. In the empire's heart, where power, desire, and cruelty collided, survival was not guaranteed. It was an art. Within the marble walls of Nero's palace, Claudia Acte discovered a world of whispers, betrayals, and hidden dangers. What outsiders saw as luxury and indulgence was, for those who lived inside, a theater of cruelty. Every corridor held a secret. Every banquet concealed political maneuvering. Acte, once a slave girl, now moved through the palace as both participant and observer, learning that desire was inseparable from danger. The emperor's obsessions extended beyond her alone. Acte saw him manipulate courtiers, interrogate attendants, and punish rivals with cold calculation. She overheard discussions of plots against his mother, Agrippina, and listened as conspiracies unfolded in hushed tones. These whispers were lessons in survival. Knowledge of the palace's hidden politics could protect her when charm and obedience might fail. Acte also observed the fragile hierarchy among women. Empress Octavia's silent resentment was a constant presence. Poppaea Sabina, though not yet prominent, was beginning to enter the emperor's orbit. Courtesans, noblewomen, and slaves each jockeyed for position, aware that favor with Nero could bring wealth and survival, while his displeasure could bring ruin. Acte realized that every glance, every word, every movement was scrutinized, not merely for beauty, but for loyalty, cunning, and adaptability. In this environment, secrecy became a form of power. Acte learned which confidences were safe to keep and which could be fatal. The slightest disclosure, the wrong phrase, could trigger envy, punishment, or political retaliation. She understood that her survival depended on silence, observation, and the careful management of Nero's capricious moods. Knowledge was armor. Discretion was survival. Even the palace's external splendor masked danger. Behind the glittering columns, mosaics, and frescoes lay chambers of punishment, rooms where disobedient slaves and courtesans were disciplined or humiliated. Servants spoke in whispers of those who had vanished or been beaten for failing to meet expectations. Acte had been trained to endure pain, but here she realized that survival demanded more than obedience. It required vigilance, insight, and subtlety. The emperor's desire for her added another layer of peril. Nero's attention, intense and unpredictable, could shield her from external threats, but it also exposed her to envy and resentment. Courtiers and attendants looked upon her with a mixture of awe and hatred, whispering rumors meant to unsettle her or undermine her influence. To navigate this labyrinth, Acte cultivated patience, intelligence, and restraint. She learned to anticipate moods, to adjust her presence, and to remain indispensable yet unobtrusive. Yet secrecy alone could not eliminate fear. Every interaction reminded her that she was a slave elevated above her station. Her life, possessions, and body belonged not to herself, but to the emperor. Even when praised or adorned in finery, she was aware that his desire could fade at any moment, leaving her vulnerable to ruin. The palace, a place of wealth and beauty, was also a cage in which her freedom was measured by the caprices of one man. Through observation, discretion, and quiet intelligence, Acte survived. She understood that the palace was a landscape of power in which beauty alone could not endure. Desire, envy, secrecy, and cunning dictated fate. In these hidden halls, Claudia Acte navigated the treacherous currents of imperial Rome, learning that survival in the heart of power required not only allure but wisdom, patience, and courage. Even the most careful courtesan could not escape the fickle nature of imperial desire. Claudia Acte, once the most coveted woman in Nero's palace, began to sense the shifting tides of favor. Poppaea Sabina, a noblewoman of ambition and striking beauty, had entered Nero's orbit. Unlike Acte, who had been trained and conditioned to endure, Poppaea carried the advantage of noble birth, social influence, and the subtle cunning necessary to manipulate the emperor's whims. Nero's attention, which had previously been fixed entirely on Acte, now wavered. At first, it was subtle. A longer conversation with Poppaea during private feasts, a fleeting glance that lingered longer than propriety allowed. Acte, who had learned to read every nuance of the emperor's temperament, recognized the danger immediately. Desire, she understood, was the foundation of her power, and it could erode faster than stone in the Tiber's current. The palace corridors, once spaces where she felt relatively secure, became arenas of uncertainty. Courtiers whispered, some openly celebrating the emergence of Poppaea, while others mourned Acte's impending displacement. Even servants who had once supported her quietly shifted allegiances. In Nero's world, proximity to favor dictated survival, and the arrival of Poppaea threatened to overturn everything Acte had endured. Acte's daily life transformed. Every interaction with Nero became laden with tension. The intimacy she once shared in private chambers was now measured, scrutinized, and compared against Poppaea's influence. Gifts, attention, and private conversations that had once been hers alone were gradually shared or redirected. The girl who had risen from the slave markets to the emperor's bed began to feel the cold shadow of replacement. Yet Acte's survival instincts were formidable. She did not confront Nero openly, nor did she display visible resentment. Instead, she relied on discretion, maintaining her role as a loyal and skilled courtesan. She observed Poppaea carefully, noting her strategies, her charms, and the subtle ways she navigated the court. Knowledge and restraint became her armor as desire, jealousy, and politics collided around her. Even as Poppaea ascended, Acte retained a measure of influence. Nero's obsession with her had not entirely faded. The emperor, unpredictable as ever, continued to call upon Acte for private performances, conversations, and counsel. Yet the imbalance was clear. Her position, once unassailable, was now precarious. Each day demanded vigilance, patience, and the constant adaptation that had allowed her to survive the perils of the palace thus far. The arrival of Poppaea also intensified external pressures. Empress Octavia's silent rage grew, now fueled not only by Acte's presence, but by Poppaea's emergence. Senators, courtiers, and palace attendants recalculated loyalties, aligning themselves with the rising favorite. The palace became a battlefield of ambition and desire, and Acte, though experienced, could not ignore the encroaching dangers. In this environment, Claudia Acte realized the limits of beauty and skill alone. Survival in Nero's palace depended equally on strategy, patience, and the careful management of the emperor's unpredictable passions. To be desired was no longer enough. To endure, she needed insight, discretion, and the ability to navigate the shifting currents of power. Though replaced in the emperor's favor, Acte remained a figure of subtle influence and quiet strength. She had risen further than any girl of her birth could have imagined, but in the volatile world of imperial Rome, every triumph carried the shadow of loss. Her life, like the palace itself, was a delicate balance of desire, danger, and survival. Claudia Acte's position in Nero's palace, once seemingly unassailable, began to crumble. The arrival of Poppaea Sabina had shifted the balance of desire and power. Nero's obsession, unpredictable as it had always been, moved toward the new favorite, leaving Acte increasingly isolated. The girl who had risen from the slave markets to the emperor's private chambers now faced the precarious reality of displacement. Even subtle signs of decline were amplified in the palace. Nero called upon her less frequently, engaged more openly with Poppaea, and allowed her presence in banquets and gatherings to diminish. Courtiers, quick to sense weakness, whispered behind her back, calculating who would benefit from her fall. Acte understood that in the world of imperial favor, absence of attention could be as dangerous as punishment, It marked one for irrelevance and eventual removal. Her daily life transformed into a delicate game of endurance. She maintained her composure, continuing to perform her duties with the same grace and discretion that had once secured Nero's obsession. Yet the emotional strain was immense. She watched the emperor's gaze linger on Poppaea, noting the small gestures of attention that once belonged entirely to her. Every smile, every word, every whispered command became a reminder of how fleeting power and favor could be. The palace's political climate compounded her precarious situation. Empress Octavia's silent fury, once directed solely at Acte, now extended to Poppaea's intrusion. Senators and noblewomen adjusted their alliances, exploiting the shifting attention to strengthen their positions. Within these layers of intrigue, Acte's skill and experience were insufficient to fully protect her. Survival now required restraint, patience, and a careful observation of the currents swirling around her. Despite this erosion of influence, Acte retained a quiet dignity. She continued to perform, to observe, and to navigate the treacherous hierarchy of the palace. Each day demanded vigilance. One misstep could invite ridicule, punishment, or outright expulsion. Her awareness of the impermanence of favor gave her a sobering perspective. She had risen higher than most slaves could imagine, but the emperor's passions, like the Tiber's tides, were unpredictable and inexorable. The fall of favor was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Nero's infatuation with Poppaea grew, drawing attention and affection that had once belonged to Acte. Gifts, private audiences, and intimate conversations were redirected. And the girl who had once been Rome's most desired courtesan began to exist in the margins. Her beauty and skill, while still remarkable, could no longer command the same power over the emperor. Yet even in decline, Acte's presence carried weight. She had witnessed, endured, and survived what few others could. She understood the palace's secrets, the emperor's volatile nature, and the dangerous interplay of desire, envy, and politics. Her fall from favor was a lesson in the fragility of status, a reminder that survival required more than charm or beauty. It required resilience, intelligence, and the acceptance of life's impermanence in a world ruled by caprice and cruelty. In the silent corridors where she had once thrived, Claudia Acte now moved cautiously. The emperor's passion had shifted, but her experience, intelligence, and dignity remained. Though her reign as Rome's most desired courtesan was ending, her story of survival amidst power, desire, and peril would endure as a testament to the dangers and endurance of life within the imperial palace. After her fall from Nero's favor, Claudia Acte's life entered a quieter, yet no less complex chapter. Removed from the emperor's private chambers and replaced by Poppaea Sabina, she was sent away from the inner palace to live with a degree of autonomy rarely afforded to former slaves. Yet freedom came with its own limitations. She retained her wealth and some privileges granted by Nero, but she no longer commanded the power of proximity to the emperor. Her existence became a careful navigation of respectability and survival. Though no longer the focus of desire, Acte's experiences within the palace had shaped her into a woman of remarkable insight. She understood the dangerous intersections of power, beauty, and politics. Every glance, every whispered conversation, and every subtle shift of mood she had observed during her rise remained with her, forming a mental map of survival that few could rival. While other courtesans faded into obscurity, Acte's presence lingered in the memory of the palace and in the annals of history. Outside the palace, she maintained contact with those loyal to her, using her knowledge and experience to guide other women who might enter the world of imperial favor. She became a mentor in subtlety and discretion, demonstrating that survival in Rome's courts required intelligence as much as charm. Acte's life was a testament to the fact that a slave, even when elevated to the emperor's private world, could exercise influence quietly, without overt power or recognition. Historians would later note Acte's unusual role in Nero's court. Unlike other courtesans or freedwomen who briefly appeared and vanished, she left a trace, not through scandal, but through endurance and strategic intelligence. Her presence challenged the rigid social hierarchies of Rome, showing that a woman born in chains could, through beauty, wit, and careful observation, shape the private world of the most powerful man in the empire. Yet her story also serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human favor. No matter how intelligent or skilled, Acte's life remained bound by the whims of those above her. The emperor's obsession was fleeting, and the palace remained a dangerous arena where one's rise could quickly become one's downfall. Her legacy is not only one of survival, but also of the relentless precarity that defined the lives of those who inhabited Rome's corridors of power. Claudia Acte spent her later years in relative peace, removed from the immediate dangers of imperial favor. She lived comfortably, yet privately, carrying the weight of memories that no silk or jewel could ease, the horrors of the slave market, the terror of the palace, and the constant awareness that her life had once depended entirely on the desires of a volatile emperor. Her story, though grounded in historical truth, resonates as a narrative of resilience amidst cruelty, of intelligence amidst obsession, and of survival against the relentless machinery of power. In the annals of Rome, her name is not celebrated with monuments or statues, but her influence endured in the subtle shifts of palace politics and in the silent lessons of survival she embodied. Claudia Acte's life, from the slave markets to the emperor's private chambers, remains a haunting testament to the costs and consequences of desire, power, and human resilience in one of history's most notorious courts.